My name is Jordan Kugler. I am one of the clinicians here at the Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment, and myself and two of my colleagues, Sloan Strike and Steph Taylor, are going to be talking to you about just a really fascinating topic today. So we kind of went pretty broad with this presentation to talk through a lot of the ways that we conceptualize trauma here at UCBT and some of the things that we are excited to learn more about and kind of put forth some of these ideas into the community. So without much more banter, let's get going. So I just, before we got going, I wanted to share a little bit about me so that you know I'm more than a PowerPoint presentation and a talking head here. So this is just kind of my journey to get to this point, hitting a few key highlights. So growing up, especially in high school, I experienced some early losses from some people who were really important to me in my life. And that kind of led me to start to question, these ideas about what makes life meaningful, what's the role and impact of trauma on someone's well-being. And I knew at that point that I wanted to do something with that. I wanted to understand that at a deeper level, or at least be able to reach people in that zone. But I didn't really know what that meant. So I kind of floundered for a little bit in college. I was a psych major, but didn't really know, is this really something I want to explore? I started into the trauma and child maltreatment literature and joined a research lab. And I eventually got connected with a program that was doing some, I guess, kind of hands-on research in Nepal. And they were looking at street orphan children and foster care parents, and essentially how can we get these trauma-focused interventions and parenting tips to these foster parents who are really struggling with kids who have a ton of trauma symptoms and need a lot of care and support in a third world country. So I went to Nepal and worked on that project for a couple months. And when I came back, I was just a lot more, I guess I had felt like I had found my path. So I joined more research labs at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is where I'm originally from, Omaha, Nebraska. Joined research labs. I worked in a child maltreatment lab there, a domestic violence lab, and then a pediatric health lab. Decided to go to graduate school for clinical psychology. About the time I was right about to submit applications, I decided, you know what, child trauma research is pretty heavy. I'm not sure if I can do this all the time. And so I kind of switched some focus and applied to a few adult and military veteran trauma research labs and ended up at Utah State. So I started with military veteran research. I dove in during my master's thesis into veteran suicide, and particularly the connections between PTSD and suicide, which really sparked my clinical interests in chronic suicide, self-harm, and how trauma can impact both of those. I then, because I had that interest, I ended up doing a practicum here at the Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment. Really got connected with the DBT model, started to understand, emotion dysregulation and the biosocial theory and all this really cool research that was connected to emotional ability and kind of these broader problems that can lead to those kind of skills deficits. Went through DBT training as a graduate student. And then I completed my internship at the Salt Lake City VA and really heavily focused on trauma work, trauma-focused interventions and mindfulness there. And now I'm back here at UCBT as a DBT therapist and trauma therapist. So that's just a little bit about me and kind of how I got to this point. Today, we are going to probably fly a little bit. I'm anticipating probably going fast. I've had my, requisite, 2.5 mugs of coffee before presentation. So don't be startled if it feels like I'm talking fast. I'm just a little nervous and caffeinated. But we're going to fly through. I'm sure that all of you here have at least some familiarity, but I couldn't just not cover the PTSD criteria. So we're going to go through that quickly. I'm going to spend some time talking about the limitations of DSM for trauma, and particularly trauma conceptualizations in the general population. Now, I want to be clear, I do not hate the PTSD criteria. I am not like an anti-DSM person, but I do, especially on our trauma team, we've started to really become more flexible with how we view certain parts of the PTSD diagnosis based on what we're seeing in the clinical or in the kind of community population. So I'm just going to share a little bit about kind of some of the research that supports that. We're going to talk about the flaws and kind of where you need to use your clinical judgment, where it's useful and where it's maybe not useful. And then we're going to dive into complex trauma. So that's a term that's starting to garner a lot more research attention. ICD-11 has actually put this in as a separate diagnostic category distinct from PTSD. So we're going to talk about what that is, and then what those proposed criteria are, how people conceptualize from a complex trauma perspective, and then we'll talk probably pretty quickly, but hopefully at least get you some information on possible interventions and adaptations for complex trauma. So that's what I'm going to cover today, and then Steph and Sloan will kind of introduce what they'll cover as well. So without much more, we'll get going. So again, like I know that this is all a review for y'all, but I just wanted to cover a couple of things related to the PTSD diagnostic criteria. So criterion A is the kind of gatekeeper component to DSM-5 PTSD. So this criterion A is related to exposure to a stressor, which means you need to have experienced what they consider a traumatic event. Now, this has invited a lot of controversy, and I'm going to talk about that later here. But the criterion A definitions that made it into the DSM were that people were exposed to death, threatened death, or actual serious injury or sexual assault, sexual violence in kind of the following mediums, I guess, either by directly experiencing it, witnessing the event, learning the event happened to a close family member, or experiencing repeated firsthand exposure to the aversive details of that event. So you can, the easiest way to think about that last one is, I think they even use this in the DSM, but police officers who are exposed to child pornography through, investigative cases and things like that. So the keys here to focus on is that they label the types of experiences that count as traumatic. So threatened death, exposure to death, serious injury, and sexual violence. And then they also kind of gave some guidance on how you had to experience that event. So you're kind of looking for links of direct exposure with criterion A. If you were familiar with DSM-4, they dropped the criteria of after exposure to this event, responding with fear, helplessness, or horror. So that went away. One of the reasons for that was the field group noted that combat veterans in particular didn't respond to these, even after going through events like this, didn't respond with these emotions at the time, particularly in a war zone. So there was like an element of doing the job, almost at times like disassociating. So that subjective criteria of responding with horror, helplessness, or fear was dropped because it wasn't super useful as they went into the DSM-5. Okay. So moving on, the second of the, now we're kind of getting into the actual symptoms of PTSD. So you can I like to think about these as symptom clusters. That's kind of how I was trained. So you're looking at these groups of symptoms now after you've been exposed to an event that we consider PTSD. So intrusive memories, you need to just have one of these for a diagnosis. Typically we see it, at least for me, when I see folks with PTSD, I've usually seen somewhere in like the 2 to 3 realm. But this can be, the key here is kind of an unwanted memory approaching or impacting your life in some way. So these can be kind of like out of the blue memories. These can be more dissociative flashbacks. It can be traumatic nightmares. And we're seeing, and another part of this criteria is that there is a response of distress following the intrusive memory in whatever form it shows up in. Avoidance, this is one of the key symptom clusters. Whenever I talk about this with patients, I say this is really the symptom cluster that maintains PTSD. We lose so much from from engaging in consistent avoidance. But the main forms of avoidance we are interested in internal, so avoidance, kind of trying to suppress or move away from or distract from thoughts, feelings, or memories related to the traumatic event. And then we also see avoidance in the form of external reminders. So people, places, things, conversations, things that remind you of the traumatic event. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time on that, but I'm going to move forward. Another new kind of piece of criteria for DSM-5 was this addition of negative alterations in cognition and mood. We saw kind of a wide range of symptoms falling into this category. This overlaps really heavily with some depression criteria, which makes sense in some ways and complicates things in some ways. So I'm just going to kind of put these up, but persistent change in kind of how you think about yourself and the world is a key here. A distorted sense of blame, kind of leading to guilt, and guilt and shame is another key one here. And then we see kind of those anhedonic, diminished interest in mood, inexability, diminished interest in positive, formally reinforcing activities, low overall affect, and kind of a sense of alienation and detachment from others. Alterations in arousal and reactivity. This is your hypervigilance symptom cluster. So looking at irritable and aggressive behavior, self-destructive, reckless behavior, kind of this exaggerated startle response. This is really heavily connected to the central nervous system and kind of the level of intensity of emotions that are coming up in response to trauma triggers that kind of burn up your emotion regulation fuel and lead to these stronger outbursts in response to trauma triggers. Again, like when I talk about this with clients, I kind of use the analogy that this symptom cluster is like you've taken your central nervous system and kind of started driving it like a teenager who just got a Camaro. It's all, you're flooring it, putting the pedal to the metal and then slamming on the brakes. And it results in this kind of like jerky, jumpy ride. And that's that kind of is the set of symptoms that we see in this category. Sleep disturbance, again, with those extreme alterations, your sleep typically gets affected when your emotions have been that keyed up. So, okay, so that was just a quick, brief overview of what the symptoms are, what's covered in the DSM. I wanted to spend a little bit of time just on like kind of the typical path of recovery from trauma. So we see, we see somewhat of an interesting pattern here in that like most people, when they're exposed to that like out of typical life traumatic experience, will have most of the PTSD symptoms about like 95% of the time in the midst of the traumatic event, and then in the days and weeks following it. At around 3 months after the event, if nothing else has happened, and that's kind of a key part to this, that you're not in a state of ongoing or recurring trauma. Those symptoms tend to go down in the general population. Only about 47% continue to have symptoms. At 9 months, that number drops just a little bit further to 42. And then at a year, we're at 30% of people still have PTSD symptoms. So this suggests that there is some recovery that's possible after a traumatic event, which is really interesting, kind of given the criterion A kind of gatekeeper role here, that there is some recovery even after you've been exposed to a traumatic event like this. The DSM did did also include diagnosis of acute stress disorder for that time period before 3 months, which is when like PTSD fully, the full diagnostic criteria kind of becomes, I guess, possible to diagnose someone with. So at 1 month, or if you've been exposed to a traumatic event, you're experiencing PTSD symptoms, but you haven't quite got to that 3 month mark, that's where acute stress disorder, that's the label for in DSM for that kind of period of time, where most people are experiencing some kind of post-traumatic response, but they're not yet eligible for PTSD. So, okay, so that's kind of our overview. I know I just like flew through that. I just wanted to quickly review and set the stage before we dive into some of the limitations of this view. So one of the keys that I wanted to dive into first was this idea of, is it about the event or about the reaction? So criterion A in the DSM has invited a decent amount of controversy. When I was doing some research for this, I found a number of papers by some just really talented researchers who dove into like why this is controversial, what's useful about it, what's not useful about it, and as you can imagine, there is research to support both sides or multiple sides of kind of the importance and a more flexible view of criterion A. So the first place I wanted to start, and this comes from Dr. Bruin's research in 2007, I think was the first paper, and then he's published several things since then in 2009 and 2017. But criterion A implies this really deep connection between a specific event and PTSD symptoms. And there's kind of an interesting relationship here then that trauma, that criterion A is the only condition in the DSM where an event is specified before is really tied to the reaction. And so that implies, again, that this idea of criterion A, that there should be something unique about the relationship between a traumatic event and the conditions or the response that follows. That idea isn't really supported just in the general research in terms of what happens or what conditions and symptoms develop after exposure to a traumatic event. So for example, we know that panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and depression and substance use are all really common following a traumatic event, which are all, again, it kind of implies that PTSD may not be super unique to just exposure to a traumatic event if these other conditions also emerge with a high degree of frequency afterwards. Sorry, I got distracted by my notes here. Okay. There we go. So if the collective post-trauma reaction causes significant impairment, does the event itself matter? So this kind of gets at this idea that that if we're seeing someone who meets the criteria for PTSD, and yet hasn't had like exposure or hasn't been exposed to what the DSM is considered a traumatic event, like how much does the event really matter? Is it more about what kind of event they experienced, or is it actually about the reaction and the kind of the post-trauma set of symptoms? As many as 60% of people recover after exposure to event, and they recover within a year. Oops, there's a typo on there. I apologize for that. But this idea is just a little funny to me, and some of the things that they've looked at in research is that there are significant groups of the population who report post-trauma reactions, report meeting PTSD criteria in response to life events that aren't necessarily considered traumatic. I'm going to get into a couple of studies here in a second that justify this, but I just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of things there related to criterion A. This last thing, interventions and funding follow diagnostic criteria. There's just a bit of a problem here with, I guess, leaving in criterion A, and I'm sorry, is someone there? Okay, I think they've been muted. So there's a little bit of a problem here with kind of like what does criterion A do to due to kind of the ongoing intervention research on PTSD. The fact that the field group decided to keep it in the DSM as a kind of this gatekeeper, in this kind of gatekeeper role, particularly I think the reason that they had was because intrusion and avoidance symptoms were incomprehensible without prior exposure to a traumatic event, does have lasting impacts. I mean, we see our randomized control trials for PTSD interventions often then have to omit people who don't meet full diagnostic criteria. So we obviously then have less information on how well, leading interventions for PTSD work for people who have post-trauma reactions, but don't meet criteria for a traumatic event. So people in this like life event trauma category. We think that they work, and you can usually adapt at least some elements of the intervention to work with those life events, but it usually struggles a little bit. There's usually a little bit of a struggle. And in fact, it can be even difficult to access, a trauma-focused therapist or access a trauma-focused intervention without that full PTSD diagnosis. There's a meta-analysis that I can send out later that talked about this idea as well of people who have these life events that cause post-trauma reactions often don't get the types of care that they need. They end up focusing on different elements of the diagnosis, like depression symptoms, rather than getting a trauma-focused EVP. Okay. So I just wanted to highlight again some research that was out here looking at this idea of is there a difference between, or is there like a really solid connection between a specific traumatic event and a life event that can cause PTSD symptoms? So Mall and colleagues in 2005 looked at post-trauma reactions in the general population. I think someone's still not muted there. They looked at, this was drawn from a large healthcare network sample of about 65,000 people. Almost 3,000 were randomly selected. 832 reported post-trauma reactions, and then they split them into groups from there based on a trauma questionnaire about worst events of their life, which included both traumatic events and life events that caused distress. They had a group of about 300 people who met criterion A and were then administered the PCL, and then a group who reported life events, which ranged from non-sudden death of a loved one, serious illness, burglary without confrontation, relational problems, problems with study work, and chronic illness. And that group was also administered the PCL. And what was interesting is that the life events group reported higher average PCL scores even after a number of adjustments. The authors of this talked about this being a pretty abnormal finding that went against, the literature at the time. And so they ran, a lot of different stratifications. They did some statistical adjustments, and even after adjusting for time since the trauma and splitting people into that post 3 month, at least 3 months since the trauma group, they found that the life events group still reported higher PCL scores. And this idea was also backed up in a recent meta-analysis in 2016, which showed that PTSD symptoms were slightly more common in events described as non-traumatic versus life events that were described as traumatic. And this was interesting. The authors did talk about, some of these life events tended to be more chronic in nature versus the traumatic events. That the traumatic events, at least in that 2016 meta-analysis, tended to be more in the single episode category. So again, the event versus reaction, there is at least some evidence that says PTSD symptoms are more important than the actual event itself. All right. another thing that's kind of commonly brought up in terms of what the DSM misses and kind of where some of the current most researched interventions kind of struggle to handle is this idea of multiple traumas. So particularly exposure to multiple criterion of A events. And most notably in childhood, or at least that's what most of the literature has looked at, can create complex symptoms. You'll often find that folks with frequent traumas meet criteria for PTSD and a number of other conditions. To summarize those conditions, we see a lot of problematic affective, mood-related disorders and symptoms, and significant interpersonal problems that have a relatively wide range in terms of unstable relationships and or no relationships at all. Difficulties with emotion regulation become much more common, particularly if the trauma was ongoing and frequent in childhood. This could be explained by a number of different ways that I just do not have time to get into today, but I'd like to talk about it at some point. And there has been some research in this area as well that with exposure to multiple traumas, there is a research backing that symptoms become more complex. These post-trauma symptoms don't just kind of stay in their silo. They start to affect other things and create kind of a new mess. So the research that I was looking at was from Coitra in 2009 and 2017, and they ran a cross-sectionally designed study, kind of taking into account the trauma timeline of people, symptoms of PTSD, and then symptoms of, I think it was 5 other mental health conditions in this affective and interpersonal realm. And they saw that overall, the collective number of symptoms that were endorsed rose by about 17% per instance of childhood trauma. Over time, once they added in the adult trauma, so total adult traumas, that symptom complexity remained significant and raised by 13%. So this again, just kind of taken together, suggests that exposure to multiple and repeated forms of trauma can lead to more problems beyond just PTSD, that there are other things that have been affected by the trauma or that are effective from the trauma and are qualitatively different from the original kind of post-trauma response. And so that research led to this idea of complex trauma reactions. So in 1997, Judith Herman kind of put this idea out here that frequent and consistent abuse, particularly if you're not able to get away from it, can lead to a distinct set of conditions that isn't really captured by normative PTSD. So this idea of complex trauma. The ICD-10, which was the DSM-4 equivalent, added this kind of categorization of enduring personality change following a catastrophic experience, which wasn't carried forward into DSM-11, but kind of reflected some of these ideas from Judith Herman's book. So we noticed that people with complex trauma tended to meet full criteria with PTSD, and also reported really strong negative cognitions and feelings about their self that were stable, really consistent with like a major depressive disorder, and kind of Aaron Beck's conceptualization of depression. They saw severe dissociation, anger management problems, preoccupation with death, self-harm, and really strong difficulties relating to others, particularly in response to like traumatic reminders. And so all of this stuff kind of was floating around as a complex trauma reaction, and it seemed to be more stable. And that was the piece that was stable and long lasting. That was the piece that kind of led to this complex trauma reaction. So what has recently come out, and I know I'm going fast here, guys, and I apologize. I just want to make sure we have time to get to all of our other presenters. But this is what complex PTSD, the diagnostic criteria put forth in ICD-11. So the ICD-11 has them meeting full criteria for PTSD, which looks a little bit different than the DSM. They don't require criterion A. They focus on 3 symptom groups in this post-trauma reaction rather than 4. And then they also add in key affective regulation and interpersonal symptoms that were kind of introduced in Judith Harmon's book. So this is what complex PTSD looks like in the ICD-11. So we see hypervigilance, avoidance, and intrusive re-experiencing in the present moment. So this idea of memories and flashbacks affecting you in the here and now after the trauma. So that has been maintained, and then the new pieces were affect dysregulation, disturbances in relationships, and negative self-concept. So the collection of these symptoms are the kind of key components for complex PTSD. This reflects kind of I guess, an emphasis on changes in self-organization, and these changes in self-organization typically result from multiple sustained, invalidating, and traumatic experiences. So childhood trauma is common here, but it's not a necessary feature. The kind of necessary feature is repeated exposure to trauma. This presentation is distinct from PTSD. So since ICD-11 has come out with this, there's been a number of, I'm kind of I don't know, I guess a research nerd like probably everyone here, but I really like reading about these factorial research and latent class, research designs. And so there's been some really cool stuff done, confirmatory factor analysis that have confirmed that complex PTSD is distinct from PTSD. Binder in 2011 published a kind of a review of the utility of complex PTSD and PTSD as it's introduced in the ICD-11, and found some really interesting research. They found, I think, 9 confirmatory factor analysis that confirmed not only that complex PTSD was distinct from PTSD, but that it was distinct from borderline personality disorder and really reflected its own kind of, I guess, collection of symptoms here. They found that the 6 clusters were like an excellent fit for for all 9 of the 9, was it 9? Yeah, 9 of the studies, that these factors tended to hold up. So there's quite a bit of research that supports this condition being distinct from PTSD. I wanted to just touch quickly on kind of how complex PTSD does differ from borderline personality disorder. The features that are most distinct from BPD are that within BPD, we have a really unstable sense of self, really like fluctuating kind of conceptualizations of the self, from being really excellent and great to poor, unrelenting crisis, kind of unable to conceptualize who folks are outside of relationships. We see unstable relationships in this like vilifying and idealizing place, and then generally higher rates of self-harm and frantic attempts to avoid abandonment. Well, in complex PTSD, we do see that kind of this like disturbance of self, but the basic, from what I saw, the kind of distinguished feature from BPD is that with complex PTSD, there's a deeply, deeply negative view of the self that doesn't really change. That really kind of correlates well with recurrent major depressive disorders kind of view of the self in the world. Relationships are typically painful and avoided. So whereas in both BPD and complex PTSD, there are problems with relationships, and complex PTSD, the sense of burdensomeness and frustrations with relationships that, impact trauma reminders, create so much pain that relationships are often just cut out of the life entirely. And then self-harm rates were essentially equivalent to PTSD samples. So with BPD, that's kind of notoriously like one of the highest rates of self-harm that we see, and complex PTSD doesn't really overlap there. So the places where they do overlap is this sense of emotion regulation difficulties, having a really limited set of coping tools, a really limited sense of understanding of emotions themselves, and how to regulate those emotions when they increase in intensity. We also see deficits in mindfulness and awareness of symptoms and the impact of symptoms and the impact of trauma triggers. And there is typically with folks with borderline personality disorder, there has tended to be kind of a higher rate of having a trauma history. So I put that in there as an overlap that we do, although it's not a requirement for borderline personality disorder, it is common that there is like a trauma history there. So that's kind of where those two overlap. So the key skill deficit that's shared between complex PTSD and borderline personality disorder is this idea of emotion regulation difficulties. And I think that this is on our post-test evaluation, but there's like a typo in it where I think it says skill and it should say skills deficit, but I just wanted to like make sure to emphasize this point here. So treatments for complex PTSD, as I'm wrapping up here, there's some disagreement on whether trauma-focused treatments are effective for the complex presentation. This data comes from a meta-analysis in 2018, but the range of effectiveness for these interventions, for just trauma-focused interventions, PTSD-focused interventions for the complex presentation, low to moderate success relative to CBT. EMDR seemed to have a slight edge. However, this meta-analysis was limited in its scope because they had to kind of, I guess, retroactively diagnose complex PTSD, in that they, saw folks who were diagnosed with PTSD and reported symptoms that were consistent with ICD-11's complex PTSD criteria, and then they went through and kind of evaluated the effectiveness of interventions for those subsamples. So it's not perfect, but that is what the research says, that the research is out there. Recently, there's been some more kind of attention put forth towards these phase-based models of treatment for complex PTSD, which basically, I'll show this here. The idea is that there are kind of two phases where you're going to address different symptoms in each phase. So with complex PTSD, phase one, we try to address, they proposed addressing problems of daily living. So focusing on the emotion regulation aspects and how those affect relationships, how that affects like kind of your sense of self, really polishing up your ability to tolerate distress, to name and describe emotions, increase awareness of dysregulation, and then ultimately increase your coping strategies and start to build awareness of hypervigilance and when hypervigilant behavior is necessary versus not useful. So kind of overlaps with most commonly with complex PTSD, that hypervigilance can be like safety behaviors and things like that. So this first phase focuses on emotion regulation and then awareness of hypervigilant behavior and how emotions are impacting relationships. And then in phase two, we look more at exposure and kind of an exploration of the trauma itself. So we start to directly address avoidance and intrusive re-experiencing with maybe a more like exposure-focused protocol like a PE. And then we address negative self-concept by using both exposures to test beliefs about the self, and then cognitive restructuring skills to focus on the negative self-concept. So that's most of what I've got for y'all. I just kind of had a couple of summary slides here. User clinical judgment when considering criterion A, and use really heavy emphasis or really heavy assessment on the core symptoms of post-trauma reactions. So really trying to develop a timeline for when these developed, so that you're not overlapping with, like, you know, a chronic depression kind of presentation, or GAD that was present before exposure to the stressful life event. Consider if there are skills deficits that have magnified the post-trauma reaction. That might be an indicator that you're kind of on the trajectory toward complex PTSD. So if someone had really low or very high distress tolerance before these traumatic, or before exposure to a stressful event, that can create more severe post-trauma reactions. A slow return to baseline kind of refers to, like, how long does it take you to recover from intense emotions, from trauma reminders, lack of overall emotion regulation, and then avoidance of interpersonal relationships. So, okay, I know I kind of flew through that, but I wanted to make sure we have time for our other presenters here today. I'm happy to answer any questions. We're going to have some time at the end. I'll kind of check the chat, but I won't respond to questions until the end of the presentation, and then I'll follow up via email with anything else that we need, or that you have for me. So thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it. And Steph, are you ready to rock here?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jordan, for kind of going over all of that criteria that goes into kind of DSM diagnosis. I think I'm excited to kind of talk about a little bit of what our trauma team's been talking about, trying to expand this idea of what is trauma, how does that fit into a diagnosis of PTSD. I think trauma is sort of this ever expanding topic. And so kind of where we're at with that now, I'm looking at other types of trauma, not necessarily traditional forms of trauma. So thanks for joining. A little bit of my background, I do a lot of trauma therapy, and I've more recently started working with couples. And my background is in the Gottman method, working with couples. So this presentation kind of draws on a lot of research with the Gottman's research, but I also looked at Carol Rusfold, Shirley Glass, Sue Johnson, so kind of a combination of how we see trauma showing up within the context of a relationship. And I'll have my references at the end of this slide. So I'm curious, you know, when we talk about this term trauma and how that fits into PTSD, you know, again, just like Jordan mentioned, there's this huge emphasis on criterion A. You know, we're really looking at people's reactions to extreme stress. And in order to warrant a diagnosis of PTSD, there has to be some sort of life-threatening event, sexual violation, witnessing one of those. So something that really kind of can destroy your physical life or a part of your physical life, like sexuality. But does our survival only pertain to our body? And so I'm curious what you all think of this. You know, again, kind of considering criterion A here. For those of you who work with trauma, I would like to know just kind of what outside of these traditional forms of trauma that you've treated. You know, I think we have certain ideas of what that ends up looking like. I don't know if you have access to your chat, but if you want to just add some things into the chat, you know, things outside of military combat, sexual or physical assault, natural disasters, car accidents, terrorism, getting a life-threatening illness diagnosis, or witnessing violence or death. What have you seen that shows up in your work, and how have you sort of decided to treat that with a trauma therapy? So kind of just considering that, and I don't actually have access to look at the chat right now, but I'm gonna just kind of share a couple of things that I've seen showing up, you know, that I've worked with that aren't necessarily traditional criterion A traumas that I've treated with trauma treatments. So poverty has shown up, racial trauma, those disaffiliating from a childhood religion, working with transgendered youth and what that looks like within the context of the family, adoption. I think in the last couple of years, just kind of seeing this collective traumatic response to the pandemic. And then when we look at relationships, how that shows up, relationship where there's substance abuse or addiction, how that could look in terms of a codependent partner feeling like they need to have control. What that looks like if the partner starts to use again. And then of course, when the relationship isn't working, what leads to divorce, the process of divorce in and of itself, and then betrayals, which is what I really wanted to focus on today. And I'm sure this is just the beginning. I'm sure there are tons more of things that people have treated that fall outside of that criterion A PTSD diagnosis. So does survival pertain to our physical body? I think our survival really kind of depends on this internal world as well as physical, as well as our body. It depends on our emotions, our values, what we believe to be true, our perceptions of the world. This kind of framework really provides comfort in some way to each of us. So when we experience an unpredictable event, so not something that we can anticipate, that kind of comes in and crashes through that world, that internal world, there's some damage that occurs there. We start to really change what we believe to be true, what we feel to be true. We start to doubt ourselves, our perceptions. And as a result, we begin to experience symptoms of PTSD. So if you think about survival in terms of the internal as well as the external, then you can really kind of see how an event like an affair might create PTSD. So I'll get into that in just a second. But I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about this interpersonal piece. As humans, we are social animals. We don't live alone. Relationships really are crucial to our survival. We need connection. And in particular, we really need connections with intimate partners. That's very important to us. So when we go through something like relationship trauma, PTSD really starts to surface and can spoil that, and can really kind of turn our world upside down. So we know there is a correlation between quality of life, quality of relationships, and I'm still struggling to figure out why the DSM kind of fails to look at this. So what does it look at? What makes something traumatic? If we look at a traditional DSM trauma, so something that involves criterion A, we found that really only about 25 to 35% of people exposed to a life-threatening event will develop PTSD. So there's a good amount of us that wouldn't develop that into PTSD. So what are the ingredients? What goes into making something traumatic? So we know heritability is high. We've been able to isolate kind of 60 genes that account for a large part of our psychological makeup or psychological wellness. It's comparable to the likelihood of developing other psychiatric illnesses like bipolar disorder, depression, addiction. I think the genetic research out there is really important. Being able to identify who's genetically at risk to developing PTSD can kind of really help us intervene quickly after a trauma. A lot of other interesting research out there isolating genes and looking at the role that plays when we undergo a traumatic event. There are some biological and neurological factors as well. There's interesting research out there showing links between things like IQ, the trait of neuroticism, and how that plays into our likelihood to develop PTSD. Other trauma, other stress around that event can add to it. So even something as simple as downplaying or dismissing your emotional reaction to it. Well, it could have been much worse. Other people have it much worse. So that invalidation piece has a tendency to kind of strengthen that stress response. A history of mental health prior to the trauma can add to that. Life stressors also, I think, if our basic needs aren't being met at that time or following the trauma, it's really hard to have the bandwidth to sit down and really process that. The nature of the event as well. More intense the event, more stress involved, the more likely it is to develop into PTSD. The one piece, again, that the DSM doesn't really touch on is this interpersonal piece. So something that's shown up consistently is, what does the support system look like during and after this trauma? That social support or lack of really is sort of a critical risk factor. So those who have limited options for social support are at greater risk for PTSD, which kind of makes sense if you think about what is happening in a traumatic event. There's sort of this sense of feeling like no one's there. There's a cry for help that isn't being answered in some way. And so after that event, it's really, we need a safe support. We need resources. We need to be able to connect to people in healthy ways, regain hope. That emotional connection piece is really big. So really understanding the role that interpersonal relationships take on, I mean, that's a huge part of working with somebody who's had trauma. And I would make the argument, just in general, we know that treatment's likely to be more beneficial depending on what that support group looks like. So I think most of us are used to asking those questions of who do you turn to when something goes wrong? So what about something going wrong within the context of your social support, in the context of your relationship? So that's really what I wanted to focus this piece of the presentation on today. I'm kind of talking about betrayal in a broad sense, and more specifically, I'll be talking about affairs as a type of betrayal. But before we get into that, I really want to look at the anatomy of an affair and kind of what leads up to that. So we really kind of have to look at a healthy relationship first. So we've been able to kind of see that there are 3 main phases of love in a lifetime. And I'm going to go over those kind of quickly. But phase 1, I think we know a lot about phase 1. We know what that sensation, that falling in love sensation looks like on a chemical level. We know what it's doing in the brain, that sort of honeymoon phase, or I have a couple that calls it the cupcake phase. For some reason, psychologists have their own word for this. They call it limerence. But really this first phase of getting just this insane influx of chemicals. And it's a very selective phase too. You know, not anyone can set this off. You have to smell right, taste right, feel right, be just right to talk to. And when all of those are in place, then the physiological changes are just insane. We are flooded with all the feel-good chemicals, neurotransmitters, hormones. You feel like you're high with DHEA. PEA, which spikes at ovulation, is sort of that magnetic pool that we see in limerence. All the pheromones kind of make you feel intoxicated. Oxytocin is a huge one. You know, that's our bonding hormone. It's secreted with touch, cuddling, orgasm, when giving birth. It really plays a huge role in kind of calming down the fear center of the brain. It also reduces good judgment. A lot of interesting studies around making decisions with oxytocin as opposed to without it. Vasopressin is an interesting one too. This is just for males. So it's sort of the hormone of monogamy in men, kind of like possessive monogamy, jealousy, and jealousy not necessarily in a pathologized way, healthy jealousy as well. So we know that that's at play. Estrogen creates softness, receptivity. Testosterone has that sexual desire. Serotonin is that emotional sensitivity. It lowers our irritability. And then dopamine is a huge one. That's that excitement, that pleasure, ability to take a risk, anticipation of reward. It's really that feeling that something wonderful is about to happen. And then progesterone, prolactin, also kind of calming, reducing aggression, and increasing nurturance. So tons of stuff happening in phase 1 of falling in love. And then we move into phase 2. So phase 2 is really, it's all about trust. So a lot of the brunt of those chemicals start to wear off. And then you're kind of left with blinders off. Is this what I want? Am I in now that I can kind of see clearly now? All those oddities and quirks that I was, you know, really invested in now might be irritating. So really kind of being able to decide, am I in this or not? And that's when really trust starts to build. We want to know, will you be there for me when I'm sick? If I'm in financial distress, will you be there for me? When we have a conflict, will you stick around to work it out with me? Negativity starts to surface during this. A lot of fighting occurs, and negativity doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing. That gives us a chance to kind of really understand our partner's internal world. We can learn a lot from that. And then attunement. You know, do you care enough to pay attention to what I am struggling with? Are you able to pick up on these cues? So phase 2 is a really important part of building trust. And then we move into phase 3. So this is where commitment comes up. This is, are you committed to me or will you betray me? And you kind of have a choice at this point. You can either stay committed with a perspective of this is what I'm missing. I could have this elsewhere. Negative comparisons can start up in this phase between your partner and somebody else, or even just an imagined person here. It really can be the beginning of a betrayal. Loyalty, on the other hand, that's really built by kind of cherishing what you have. You can nurture gratitude for what you have in this phase, as opposed to the negative comparisons, which start to cultivate resentment. You're hyper-focused on what you're not getting. And so when you're able to shift into that loyalty phase, then you're able to invest more and more into the relationship. This really kind of shades your view of things of, you know, feeling lucky to be with this person, feeling like they're irreplaceable. And you start to give more, you sacrifice more, it kind of changes your overall perspective here, and you're not holding back. And that's necessary to kind of solidify this phase 3. So I think the really cool thing about this is when all 3 of these phases work out, the evidence really shows that you can stay in love over the course of a lifetime. So not just love your partner, but be in love with your partner. And so there have been a lot of really interesting studies out there looking at fMRIs and how people light up when they look at a picture of their loved one. And there's just this whole part of their brain that just lights up well into phase 3. So there's no shelf life on this. But the key is you kind of have to work through all 3 phases. So what happens if you don't make it through all 3 phases? What happens if you shift over into that betrayal piece? Now we kind of have an idea of what love looks like. Let's kind of look a little bit more in depth at what happens when that love is shattered and when an affair occurs. And I'm using affair loosely here. I think I wanted to define my terms here. I'm kind of using this within the context of a monogamous relationship. So there's been an agreement that there won't be sexual connections with others, emotional connections with others. But this is where this falls under that broader category of betrayal. So if you are in an open relationship or a poly relationship and that's agreed upon, betrayal still happen if there's secrecy, if things are being kept from your partner, if you're turning to get your needs met from somebody else and not your partner, if it's taking away from that relationship. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm referencing an affair. But really, I want to talk about kind of this broad view of what leads up to just betrayal, not necessarily an affair. So we found that there's a sort of cascade effect that takes place. Now, this is really based off of Shirley Glass's clinical work, Carol Rusbolt's work on commitment, and then a lot of Gottman research as well. We found that there's this sort of glacial or slow cascade that leads to betrayals. And in all of these, there's this sense of needing to avoid conflict and needing to avoid being transparent or self-disclosure. And so I'll break that down here a little bit more. But basically what we're seeing is people just aren't telling each other what they need. So they begin to get their needs met elsewhere and they start to live this parallel existence to each other. And that starts to affect the relationship. So sorry for this slide. I wanted to get everything up there and I'll kind of go over each of these specifically. So there's the beginning parts of betrayal can look like, again, these basic needs that we have: attention, affection, approval. You know, we need them kind of from all relationships, but especially a romantic partner. And so there's this sense of not getting that. And the Gottmans and the Gottman method really talk about this idea of bids for attention. It could be something as little as, hey, look out that window at that interesting car. Does your partner turn to you? Do they acknowledge that, whether verbally or not? Or do they ignore you? And so that's kind of this idea of bids, no matter how small or big, how many times is that being responded to by our partners? And they've done some incredible research. They've been able to get the numbers there, looking at relationships that are successful, ones that aren't. Majority of the time in those successful relationships, the partners are turning towards those bids for attention more than 80% of the time. And the relationships that end up in divorce or that deteriorate, they see more closer to 33%, where just the majority of the time these bids are being ignored. So it sounds like something so small, but that's what starts to really start this chasm in the relationship. And then when that happens, your need isn't being met. So then you start to really, when you see your needs being met elsewhere, start to compare your partner to that. So something as simple as your neighbor smiles at you and you feel warm inside and you think, wow, it's been so long since I felt that from my partner. Why can't they be more like this neighbor? So really that comparison piece starts to take over. Something else too that I think is interesting is during this cascade, there's this sort of tendency to feel much more flooded or physiologically aroused when being around your partner's negativity. So we can handle negativity when things are good. The minute that negativity happens and you're already making those negative comparisons, you're feeling like your partner isn't turning towards you for those bids for attention, then all of a sudden you begin to have a physiological reaction to that. And then feeling like my partner is not there for me. So you start to turn away, you bid for attention less because you're just not getting the response that you're needing. Conflict starts up and it becomes this negative absorbing state, meaning that when we get into negativity, it's really hard to get out of it. It's like it's overload. We don't know how to repair this. And that starts to lead to this helplessness. Again, this conflict avoidant piece that's a part of betrayal. The Gottmans talk about this emotional bank account, but it's self-explanatory. If we feel like our needs are being met, the relationship can really withstand a lot. But the minute that that's depleted, it's just, the smallest things become big slights. We feel it deeply, and it's hard to recover from that. So we avoid conflict. Then there's this negative spillover that goes into other interactions, and it could be something small like just asking about your day, and that can feel negative, or big things like planning a trip with your partner. And if there's negative spillover, it's you just don't even enjoy time away with your partner. And then there's this parallel lives that starts to happen. You avoid self-disclosure, connecting with your partner feels futile, addressing these conflicts feels futile. So you're bidding less for attention and connection, and you're just investing less in the relationship, which can feel very lonely. And I think there becomes this narrative too of, I'm feeling lonelier with this person than without. And so then you start to really talk to yourself in a different way. You start to depend less on your partner. You start to substitute what's missing. So you go to, you go to a coffee shop and the barista asks you about your day, and all of a sudden it's like you're being seen, and that feels really good. And you're like, why can't my partner, make me feel this way? There was a time, I'm not experiencing that anymore. But instead of going home and saying, hey, this barista made me feel really good in this interaction, I really miss when we could connect like this, stating what you need from your partner, you don't do that because you see that leading to yet another fight. So that starts to, the secrecy then starts to set in here. Negative comparisons are off the charts here. We find what's not there elsewhere. You're very aware of what's missing. You're confiding in others. You're creating a narrative that's maximizing your partner's negative traits, minimizing their positive. I'm really starting to feel sorry for myself here. Defensiveness increases, criticism. It's not my fault, it's theirs. You start to confide in others because you can't talk to your partner, you're miserable, you're looking for that support outside of the relationship. And even the story of us starts to change. So, you might have a really great way of looking at how this relationship started, and then you go to revisit that, and it's almost like you're painting it with negativity of, oh yeah, that time a month into a relationship, they did this thing that should have been a red flag. You're looking for all these holes. Contempt builds, and then resentment takes over instead of gratitude. And so this almost like this culture in this relationship shifts. And we start to make some pretty major negative attributions on our partner when we're in pain and we're feeling resentful. And the thing that they found the most, the attribute or the trait that we go to a lot is seeing our partners as selfish. And I think that's really interesting because selfishness is almost like the opposite of trust. Trust my partner is interested in me, cares about me and my welfare. Selfishness is not that. And we see them as only interested in themselves. And now all of a sudden our partner becomes a threat in some way. So our walls go up. More loneliness, becoming more vulnerable to connecting in other ways, so other relationships, seeing the refusal for sex as rejection, feeling sulky or angry, just adding to that narrative. And now all of a sudden, you're no longer looking at other relationships as a threat to yours because yours has become the threat. So you start to confide and connect more, and you're meeting these needs with other people. So innocent liaisons might occur here. But then more and more is kept from your partner, deception builds. And eventually you are just a completely parallel life from your partner. You're doing your own thing, you're going to others to meet your needs. You're not expressing your needs to your partner. And then that can lead to the actual affair, which is crossing the boundary, real betrayal. Deception sort of just becomes this way of life. You're taking more risks, and then you end up doing something. And so again, this is just kind of what leads up to that, what leads up to the affair. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, whether you work with couples or individuals. If you've ever had somebody come into you that's just discovered an affair, everything feels upside down. I mean, their whole world just gets turned upside down. And it really does cause this post-traumatic stress reaction. So let's go back to the criteria. Again, we've got this conflict of avoidant behavior. We've got this avoidance of self-disclosure or not being transparent. So with the rest, and I know Jordan already went over this in detail, but just kind of looking at the basic criteria aside from criterion A, if we look at this, I mean, there's a lot that happens to that betrayed person. They're experiencing a lot of these symptoms. There's these intrusive thoughts, flashes of images that they might experience. They might not have seen what happened, but they're imagining the sex their partner had or the connection they built up with somebody, again, thinking emotional affair, physical affair. These images are coming into their head. They're unwanted, they're unexpected, meaning they have no control over them. And then it jacks up their emotions, like their negative emotions. They might have more nightmares. They become hypervigilant. They feel like now all of a sudden I have to just, figure out, is this affair over? They're looking for more signs of betrayal. This person that they trusted now seems untrustworthy. So now they're looking for those signs. They might be alternating between feeling numb and shut down and then having a huge wave of painful emotion. Depression spikes here, maybe even suicidal ideation. Just classic signs of PTSD with somebody who's been betrayed. So what does that mean for us? It means that if we're dealing with a couple that's coming in, we might really want to just get into what was going on. Let's look at that cascade effect. At what point did we miss the mark here, and start to look for the needs that weren't being met and kind of being able to analyze that relationship in that way. But that can actually make everything worse for that person experiencing PTSD, and then affect the partner as well, because it affects both. So really, we've got to just address it from a trauma perspective first. So you might have a couple that comes in, and the person who had the affair says, really, do we have to go over this again? I've answered all of their questions. I've said I'm sorry over and over again. Why do they have to keep bringing this up? Well, the reason they have to keep bringing this up is because they're suffering from PTSD. They don't want to keep bringing it up. They don't want to keep thinking about this or feeling this way, having these terrible thoughts, the suspicions, that's really kind of hijacking who they are. But nonetheless, it's there. The PTSD is there. And they're both experiencing the effects of that. So that needs to be named in session. And maybe you go over the criteria with them and kind of really being able to frame it within the context of PTSD, and that you're going to be treating the trauma first. So really, I think, thinking about other issues that people might be bringing in with trauma, I think traumatic grief is a great example of that. In order to kind of get into a place where we can treat that grief, where we're allowing our client space to sit in that grief, we have to treat the trauma. That fight or flight is active. It's almost preventing access to those other emotions, and being able to sit with our negative emotions without fear is how we are able to process that. So we really need to address the fear piece, the trauma piece first. And then once you're able to address that, then you ask the betrayed partner, what is it that you need now? What do you need to feel better about the situation? What kind of transparency do you need moving forward? Really kind of, we're working with somebody who's experienced trauma, and there's that sense of not having control, feeling powerlessness, feeling like nothing they could have done could have prevented this. The way to do that is just giving some of that control back, empowering them to be able to state what they need at this point. And then you're coming at it with empathy. So I think this is a huge piece, because you're not just providing empathy for the betrayed partner, you're having to give it to both. Otherwise, if you're doing couples therapy, they're not going to stick around. So really making sure that you're not jumping into analyzing what went wrong, because that almost puts blame or accountability on the betrayed person. And then you're empathizing with both parts, not taking sides. So, being able to say, you're devastated. I know you feel like your whole world is just turned upside down. This is a major catastrophe. You don't know what to believe. You thought this person was one thing. It seems like they're another. Your whole framework for this relationship just got destroyed. Just must be horrible. And to the person who had the affair, this must be terrible for you. It's so hard to hear your partner's pain. It must be difficult for you to have to hear it over and over again. Making sure that you're going back and forth between both parties here. So kind of balancing that empathy. I think when somebody has been betrayed, they're really just looking for an ally. And it's easy to kind of fall into that role. So making sure that you're going back and forth with that. And then you're able to do some of that good trauma work with them. We're looking at building up coping skills and addressing distorted thoughts or reframing those thoughts. Giving them some control back over things like self-care, physical health. And then you can really start to address the relationship piece. And again, I'm not advocating for any specific type of treatment, just kind of being able to address the affair or that betrayal as you would PTSD before moving into that. Okay, and now I'm going to shift over to Sloane's presentation. As a reminder, she wasn't able to be here, so it's pre-recorded. And so she won't be here for the Q&A afterwards. Jordan and I will be here, but she left her email in her slides. So if you have questions, you can send that to her. And I believe in the chat, her email is listed there as well.
I wish that I could be there live with you all today. Unfortunately, I'm not able to, but please put any questions in the chat and I can answer them afterwards. I'll also provide my email address if you'd like to send me any questions directly. And thank you, Jordan and Stephanie, for all of your work. So as most of you probably know, the statistics are pretty staggering. So studies show that between 40 to 50% of all youth will experience a traumatic event by age 18. The National Center for PTSD studied trauma in US teens and found 8% experienced sexual assault, 22 physical assault, and 39 witnessed violence. And then you can imagine that a staggering number of the youth who seek out mental health support have experienced trauma. So what gets missed? So today I'm going to be focusing on two aspects of trauma-informed care that often get missed with children and adolescents. The first is a thorough assessment that really teases apart reactions to trauma from other emotional and behavioral symptoms in children. So a lot of kids are misdiagnosed because these issues are really complicated and they are hard to tease apart. And so it's important to use a differential diagnostic approach. The second is the importance of parent work throughout treatment with the child. So many parents of traumatized kids are traumatized themselves, often from the same event or set of events as their child, but also sometimes they've had their own traumatic events that affect the way that they can process and respond to their child. So let's start by talking about how to do a thorough assessment. And it's probably important to just briefly mention that traumatic experiences for kids often involve a threat to life or safety, but any situation that leaves them feeling overwhelmed and isolated can result in trauma, even if it doesn't involve physical harm. So if you work with kids in your setting, then trauma-informed care might also be appropriate for kids with emotional abuse or attachment wounds, children with a history of depression or anxiety that has really wreaked havoc on their life, children who have been the victim of bullying or childhood neglect, or commonly overlooked events like surgery, the breakup of a significant relationship, a divorce between their parents, sense of security, or a deep humiliation. So this slide here shows a summary of sort of the range of symptoms that we see, and it really shows how broadly we see trauma symptoms across the board in kids. So we have affective symptoms, anxiety, anger, irritability, sadness, mood swings. We see behavioral symptoms, avoiding, difficulty sleeping, modeling maladaptive behaviors, traumatic attachment, substance abuse is a big risk factor for teens, and self-injury. And then cognitive symptoms, which we'll circle back to that a little bit later, and we will talk about that specifically as it pertains to parents, and then hyperarousal symptoms. So why is childhood PTSD missed so easily? Well, it turns out there are lots of reasons. The age of the child matters. Very young children don't have words to describe what happened to them. And even young children over 3 may not have expressive language to accurately relay events. So they might not be able to have the counting or sequencing skills to report how many times or in what order abuse occurred. And these limitations can also apply to older children with developmental delays. Memory problems. Children often push down or block traumatic memories when they try to resurface, or they numb their emotional response to the memory so they don't appear distressed on the outside. Avoidance. Many children want to avoid bringing back frightening memories, and so when a counselor or a therapist asks questions about what happened, children may only give brief surface answers. Then inaccurate reporting. So parents and caregivers are unlikely to tell the truth about a child's trauma if they caused it. For example, birth parents downplay their use of tobacco, alcohol, or drugs when talking to adoption agencies. Some parents might lie to keep the child in the home and avoid prosecution. And then sometimes adoptive or foster parents are simply unaware of traumatizing events that the child has experienced in the past. Then the last one is, many trauma symptoms are similar to the symptoms of other childhood mental illnesses. And diagnosis is much more difficult for children living with more than one mental illness as well. So sorting through which symptoms are trauma related and which aren't can really be a challenge. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about for a minute here. Is this can be an example of how differential diagnosis can be really tricky. There's an incredible amount of overlap, for example, between hyperarousal symptoms and the physiological symptoms of GAD. So in hyperarousal, that occurs when a person's body suddenly kicks into high alert, when they're reminded about their trauma, for example. And so even though a real danger may not be present, the body is acting as if it is. And the same survival instinct kicks in as at the time of the trauma. And then you compare that to what somebody with GAD might experience in an acute moment of stress or distress. And it is very, very similar. Also think about avoidance, right? Both highly anxious kids and traumatized kids use avoidance and social withdrawal to cope. So this just gives you a sense of how complex the differential diagnosis and comorbidity can be. Here are a few more examples. So hypervigilance can look like paranoia. Aggression and oppositional behavior can look like ODD, right? Traumatized kids often respond to frightening situations or triggers with angry outbursts and irritability. Self-injury and emotional instability can look like borderline personality disorder. It makes sense that a lot of patients with BPD do have a history of trauma. And then mood swings and oversensitivity to emotional or environmental triggers, that can look like disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. Trauma responses are often highly emotional, so they look like mood swings used to diagnose a mood disorder. So a few more. ADHD is a common misdiagnosis because of the way children respond to intrusive memories of trauma. So their internal reliving of the memory results in a lack of concentration that resembles ADHD. Or the memory might make them move on to something new quickly in an attempt to avoid it. And a kid on high alert may also appear sort of jumpy during the day or have sleep difficulties at night, which are also symptoms of ADHD. Avoidance and sleep disturbances and restricted emotions, those can all look like depression. Kids often use numbing to cope with traumatic memories. They might show very little emotion or have flat affect. And then phobias, a child's irrational fears of something may look like a phobia. So, but for a traumatized child, right, that behavior is an avoidance response to something related to the original trauma. So, of course, differentiating these symptoms is really important because treatments vary. So when we look specifically at trauma symptoms by age group in kids, let's start with birth to 3. So many of the intrusive symptoms for children in this age group concern sleep. Babies and toddlers might have a hard time falling asleep or have nightmares once they fall asleep. They also may respond sort of violently to something that reminds them of the original trigger. For example, a 1-year-old who was bitten by a dog might become really dysregulated at the sight of a dog. Babies and toddlers will often have a tendency to startle easily, a common arousal symptom. They could have excessive fussiness, temper tantrums, separation anxiety, and then avoidance symptoms. That would be sort of withdrawing, avoiding people associated with the trauma, sadness, or a lack of demonstrating those emotions. Now, you can see how in this age group, it really is hard to differentiate trauma symptoms from other typical developmental issues. I know for me, both of my kids experienced most of these things at some point when they were babies. So before kids are verbal, we're of course relying much more on a caregiver's report of any trauma history, but these are the things we're looking for. Okay, so at ages 4 to 6, we continue to see sleep issues caused by memories that make kids too scared to fall asleep or might intrude as nightmares. And then they might reenact their trauma repeatedly when playing with friends or family. Intrusive memories might make it hard to pay attention. And at this point, kids are in school. So flashbacks might look like daydreaming and can lead kids to being distracted during school and falling behind. And kids who are on high alert might act out or seem to have an uncontrollable temper. They might have a lot of stomach aches and headaches or startle easily. And then avoidance symptoms at this age are caused by fear. So they're afraid of being away from their parents or near anyone who is associated with the original trauma. So they can appear to be highly anxious and insecure. In the next age group, 7 to 12, the symptoms are pretty similar to what we just talked about. Sleep issues, lack of attention during school, Younger children in this group may reenact the trauma through play, but as they get older, they may tell others about the event repeatedly. So they may seem to have overly dramatic responses to bumps and bruises, or they may be anxious about their own safety and the safety of family members. Avoidance symptoms might be saying that they don't feel well to avoid situations they fear, or emotional numbness. And moving on to teens. So as teens approach adulthood, their symptoms are less like those of children and more like those of adults. So the intrusion of traumatic memories might cause sleep disturbances. They may want to talk about the traumatic event more than seems healthy, and in great detail sometimes. And again, they may have a hard time concentrating in school. And when in the state of hyperarousal, traumatized teens tend to be very impulsive. So they might spend money impulsively, they might drive too fast, they might engage in risky sexual behavior. They also might appear depressed and isolate themselves. So teens with PTSD, as I mentioned before, are at higher risk for using drugs and alcohol to avoid their feelings and fears, or at least to numb them for a while. They can also develop eating disorders or self-harming behaviors. And then some teens will deny any emotions about the original event or refuse to discuss it, or sort of be unable to recognize their own emotions regarding the event. That's all pretty common. So assessment is vitally important here because, again, this is all really hard to tease apart and get an accurate diagnosis. So not only do we want to be precise with the diagnosis, but also it helps us to inform treatment. So trauma screening should always evaluate the presence of two critical elements. The first is exposure to potentially traumatic events or experiences, and the second is traumatic stress symptoms and reactions. So in terms of how we measure these things, we have options. For formal assessment measures, there tend to be three types. The first is a child self-report tool. So child-completed tools are appropriate for kids typically ages 8 and up who are able to read and complete the questions. Caregiver-completed tools, that would be for infants, toddlers, young children, or children with developmental delays. Then it's more appropriate to have a caregiver complete the trauma screening. And then a provider completed tool, that would be the clinician or other professional can administer certain tools while reviewing and integrating available information about a child. So that might be court reports, interviews with caregivers and teachers, other questionnaires, and behavioral observations. So these tools can be really useful in consolidating a range of information in one place that is readily accessible. It's also, in terms of the more informal aspects of assessment, I like with younger kids, there's a book called A Terrible Thing Happened, which just really gives an opportunity to discuss symptoms of trauma. And then it's always important to get a caregiver's perspective, even if you're not using a formal caregiver or parent report tool. And then, you know, assessing the environment, developmental, social context, and your own clinical observation. All of those are really important along with the formal instruments. And here's a list of some formal assessment instruments that can be really helpful, all evidence-based, all well-researched, and really helpful in getting an accurate PTSD diagnosis in children and adolescents. Okay, so back to what gets missed. So the last piece I'm going to discuss today is parental trauma. And I'm going to be using TF-CBT or trauma-focused CBT as the basic structure to discuss ways in which you might see some of these issues pop up. But these things will pop up in any trauma-informed clinical care. So TF-CBT is really the gold standard for treating kids and their parents after a trauma has occurred. The participation of the parent is tremendously important here, and research shows that kids improve much more rapidly if their caregivers are doing parallel work to their children the whole course of treatment. So in fact, I'm certified in TF-CBT, and I do 2 sessions every week with a family that I'm working with, any family that I'm working with. And that would be 1 session with the child and then 1 session with the non-offending caregiver. And that's really important. So oftentimes the perpetrator of a trauma is a parent. And so it's really important in this work that whoever the caregiver is who is a part of treatment is not the offending parent. So that might be the other parent. If that parent is not available, it might be a grandparent who is a caregiver and a part of the child's life. It can be done without parent involvement, but it's not ideal. So treatment goals. For the purposes of this presentation, we aren't going to be talking about the goals for treatment for the child, but for the caregiver, those goals include discussing their own feelings and thoughts about the child's traumatic experience, learning techniques to improve parenting skills, improving communication through family sessions, preparing the parent to support the child when sharing the child's trauma narrative, and in cases where the parent has also been a trauma survivor, there is an opportunity for the parent to process how their trauma impacts their child. So we start with psychoed, and this is for, again, this is a parallel process. So as we're doing psychoed with the child, we are also doing psychoed with the parent. And children and even adults are often confused after a traumatic event, especially interpersonal trauma. They may blame themselves. They may be holding on to myths because they've been misled or deliberately given incorrect information. So we want to help them understand the child's symptoms through the context of trauma. They're not a bad kid. They're not damaged. These reactions are normal. And we start with providing them with very specific information and very specific language. So we define terms, we name the trauma, and we clarify any incorrect information and then provide accurate information. What is sexual abuse, for example? Prevalence, how often do things like this happen? Also, the distinction between often and normal. So something can be unhealthy, but also be common. And then the effects of trauma. How do kids feel when they have been sexually abused? What are common responses to abuse? You know, for example, normalizing it. 50% of kids who experience domestic violence have serious behavioral issues. That's really helpful for a parent to have that context. Connecting the child's symptomatology to their specific trauma. You know, for example, I worked with a teenager who was sexually abused in the middle of the night in her bed, and she, at 16, began wetting the bed after the trauma, and that made no sense to the child and to her grandmother. And so just giving them some information and normalizing and connecting their specific symptoms to their trauma is the goal here. This is also a way to introduce gradual exposure to talking about the trauma, because that can be very anxiety provoking and dysregulating, understandably, for parents and caregivers. So parenting skills, that parents have a lot of vicarious trauma themselves. And it's important to spend time processing that with them. Most caregivers are going to experience some symptoms of trauma after a child has been through something scary. You know, often it's hypervigilance, you know, always being on edge, always being worried about their child. It could be intrusive thoughts and memories about the trauma. That doesn't mean that they also have PTSD, but if you can tell that a parent is really struggling, then it's helpful to have a conversation with them around options for an assessment or potentially treatment for themselves. But through this all, you're working with them and you have an open dialogue, and the goal is to give them skills to help their kids manage difficult feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And they're learning that by doing it for themselves too. Behavior management training comes in helpful here because it can be tricky in these situations for parents of traumatized kids. You know, they often feel guilty about disciplining their children or setting firm boundaries after they know their child has been through something scary. And so behavior management strategies become really useful for helping to give them some of that structure. So now I'm going to jump forward to a little later in treatment when we are ready for cognitive work and for the trauma narrative, because this can be a really difficult piece for parents. So here are some of the common cognitive trauma symptoms. Irrational beliefs. Here I've listed from the child's perspective what they might be experiencing. Distrust, you know, loss, betrayal of the social contract, distorted self-image, and then accurate but unhelpful cognitions. Those are really hard. And the goal is to help children and parents view events in more accurate and more helpful ways. So this is an example of challenging an inaccurate cognition for a parent. So it might be something like, it's my fault that I didn't know what was happening. I should have known. And this is something you could do a pie chart for. So you would identify what portion of the blame belongs to the parent, to the child, and to the perpetrator. This is all from the parent's perspective. So you can see in the first graph, you know, the parent says, I should have known, and I've got a part of that pie. And then I also, you know, I feel like my daughter, she never told me what was happening. So maybe she has a little piece of the pie. And then he has most of the pie. You know, the perpetrator has the majority. He knew it was wrong. And the goal here is to challenge those thoughts and help generate alternative thoughts. So regret versus responsibility. This is an important piece. So you can regret making certain choices, but that is different than taking responsibility for someone else's actions. So the goal here would be to wind up with this solid blue pie chart. You know, I didn't recognize what was happening. I didn't know the signs to look for. And she was scared. She didn't know what to do. But he knew it was wrong, and he is responsible. So when we get to narrative work, and again, I'm moving very quickly through, you know, the treatment pieces of TFCBT, but focusing again on where you might see some of this pop up for parents. If treatment gets to a place where the child is ready to create a trauma narrative and then share it with their caregiver, this is another point at which the parent's own response to the trauma will be hugely important. So for kids, it can be helpful to think about the narrative sort of like a book, a story in a book, and to break things into chapters. And over the course of several sessions, the child is encouraged to describe in more and more detail what happened before, during, and after the trauma, as well as thoughts and feelings at each point. And a significant part of the narrative sessions is helping the child with the distress they experience during those sessions. So validating, normalizing, using relaxation skills. And then simultaneously, caregivers need to be preparing to hear the narrative and to process their own thoughts and feelings and fears. So this part of the treatment focuses on directly exploring and correcting the child and the caregiver's inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts, specifically related to the traumatic experience and its meaning for the family and the child and the parent. So, for example, I worked with another child who, another young teenager who had been stalked and attacked on her walk to school. And so the parent, understandably, had the very strong belief, I can't let her be alone or something bad will happen to her. So that felt like a fact to them. So we talked about predicting the future, catastrophizing, and what's the message that this sends to her? The underlying thought is she can't handle this. And how do we promote a sense of empowerment? So we can't keep bad things from happening, but we can teach her these skills so that she can make safe decisions in dangerous situations. We might use evidence for or against. So what evidence do we have that she has been able to handle a difficult situation? Has she even had the chance to try? So the alternative thought there might be, even though it makes me deeply uncomfortable, I have to let her try. And then we get to parent-child conjoint sessions. So after the child has completed the narrative and feels ready to share it, then we have joint sessions. And the goal is to promote positive, healthy communication between the parent and child about the trauma. And this serves as a launching pad for open dialogue in the family. Parents have the opportunity to demonstrate their comfort in hearing and talking about the trauma, while also modeling appropriate coping, which you've practiced with them ahead of time. And the child has an opportunity to share the narrative and experience a sense of pride in being able to tackle their trauma, which really helps to alleviate feelings of shame and distress. And then hopefully the groundwork is laid for parents and children to continue that therapeutic work at home, even after the therapy is over. So again, not every treatment or TFCPT will end with a trauma narrative, but these are skills that are pretty generalizable for work with parents and kids who have experienced trauma. And I hope that it was helpful, in thinking through clinical considerations in your own work. Please feel free to send any questions to my email, which I've put right here. And thank you all again.
If anyone has any questions, Steph and I would love to be able to answer those. All right, Patricia has a question here in the chat saying they work with immigrants who face relentless ongoing trauma exposure on the news. Any recommendations? Steph, I don't know if you have initial thoughts on that. I think my initial response is, again, like I want to do like a really thorough assessment to see like how long-standing those the reactions are and like pervasive the reactions are becoming, kind of the level of impairment on like a day-to-day basis. My initial response is to do a lot of kind of almost like open-ended processing, seeing like what the reactions to the stories are pressing up against, whether that's like threatening a value, just threatening like kind of a personal story, like the obvious like discrimination and policies that are some of our, those news outlets push, and talking about kind of how to manage those reactions, and like, I guess, building awareness on like why it's like where the exposure is coming from and where the like reactions coming from. And then I just say that as like kind of like an exploration point to decide if there would be more like deeper, almost like exposure or, kind of cognitive restructuring, more typical trauma focused interventions that you would go for. But I'd start with like, that assessment of like almost kind of Socratic questioning of what is underneath the reaction to, those stories on the news. Steph, I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
I was just thinking, if they're not ready necessarily for exposure work, there are ways to limit that information, staying up to date without feeling saturated or having kind of an overwhelming response to what's going on in the news. I can't think of off the top of my head what those websites are, but they're kind of just like headers, so you can kind of see what's going on without like all of the details that can kind of really add to that potential trigger response.
Yeah,
and then being able.
I saw Cami put in the chat, just turn off the news. I know that's my response as a provider at various times when I get burned out. The news goes off and How I Met Your Mother goes on instead. So I put my head in the sand for a little while and then re-engage when I'm better able to. But I think that's at least where I would start. But yeah.
But still needing to stay informed. I mean, there's the reason.
Absolutely, yeah.
So like finding that balance.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, what Cami just said. I think there's privilege in being able to just shut off the news, but limiting exposure to it, and exposure in a way that you're not having those being able to sensationalize those kind of news stories and being able to kind of stick with the facts. Yeah. And I wish I could think of what the apps are for that, because I remember going over that with a few clients before, where they kind of switched from like the main types of news media, and then they were just getting kind of like basic details without all the emotions behind it. And then being able to switch into exposure work, if that feels helpful.
If there are topics that you are really interested in learning more about, we'd love to hear any like additional presentation ideas. I know Steph and I are always looking for things we can kind of take a deep dive into. And so if there are particular topics you'd like to hear more about, things that you'd like to kind of just get more information on, I'd be happy to see if we have people who already have specialties in that area here, or kind of dive into it and develop a presentation. So anything that you all are curious about or that you feel would be, an additional piece to this presentation, go ahead and throw it in the chat or send us an email. That would be helpful for us too. So, all right. We'll hang out for a couple more minutes, but if you've got to hop off, go for it. 2 o'clock. Thank you all for your attention and time and wonderful questions. I appreciate you. All right, there's a few folks in here, but I haven't seen any new questions come through. So we'll go ahead and end the meeting, but thanks again for your time today.